Berevzez, Insihamar Medzbadive, Shad Chandaragalam, Chris Bohjalian speaking to you from my library here in Vermont. Welcome. It is indeed a privilege and an honor to be with all of you this evening as together, albeit virtually, we commemorate the 105th anniversary of the start of the Armenian genocide and discuss where we are today. Usually we are gathered together in our communities in New Jersey or Michigan or Massachusetts in Times Square. Tonight, in some ways, we are more together than ever. I am always so proud of the ANCA and grateful to the ANCA. But right now, more than ever, the idea of an ANCA Eastern Region virtual April 24th commemoration event weekend running through Sunday, brilliant. The reality is that in the decade or so that I've spoken to our communities on April 24th, I've watched the number of our survivors dwindle. We all have, which is why it is so important that all of us here in North America and around the world bear witness to the 1.5 million and continue striving for justice. The reality is that we are always living in history. Sometimes in the daily need to stock, not hoard, the pantry, get the kids to Little League and dance class, and do whatever it is we do for a living, we forget that history is a river in which we always are wading. Sometimes it's serene and we are barely aware of its ripples. Sometimes it's a maelstrom of whitewater and we are crashed with bone-crushing ferocity against the boulders. Think 1915, think 1988, think 2020. This is one of those moments. We are all a little fragile right now. Someday, we will look back on this time and know precisely where we were when we stopped shaking hands. We started standing further apart. We saw supermarket shelves bereft of toilet paper. We realized the bookstore had closed. We lost our job. We learned someone we knew was sick. We learned someone we knew had died. When this pandemic spring becomes the Renaissance summer, and yes, that is my hope, we will all be a little kinder with one another and a little more patient. We, as Armenians, are resilient. Almost all of you watching tonight are descendants of a survivor. It's in our DNA. It is, yes, Darwinian. We live always with one foot in 1915 and one foot in the present, as we do tonight, April 24th, 2020. We are in the midst of a wondrous reawakening here and in our beloved Hayastan, and have been since the late 20th century. That revival is evident in the work of the ANCA and its chapters. 100-0 this session, folks, unanimous U.S. Senate recognition of the Armenian genocide, and in the way the ANCA is fighting daily for Artsakh in Washington and bringing Washington to Artsakh. And make no mistake, Artsakh is our line in the sand. That metaphor is apt when we recall 1915. Artsakh has always been, is now, and always be Armenian. Those are among the pillars on which we are fighting for justice. Moreover, speaking as a writer, when I look at the transcendent work that Armenian Americans are doing right now in the arts, I am left humbled. Rock musicians, screenwriters, novelists, painters, poets, playwrights, pianists, pop stars, actors, sculptors. I could give you a very long litany. This evening's program will include a message from the ANCA Eastern Region, a keynote from Aram Hamparian, Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, a discussion of justice and reparations from Dr. Jermaine McCalpin, Chair, African and African American Studies at New Jersey City University, and a message from the Prelate. One housekeeping note. You will be able to replay tonight's program on Facebook, our Facebook page, and YouTube. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Serene and Bohjalian to sing our national anthems.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Medhareli azadanga ora peletaretar yurvortiga arkanchume azadanga hayastan yurvortiga arkanchume azadanga hayastan ahayeh bay kezmiturosh borim zerkov kortetsi kishirnera yes kunchera ardasukov devatsi kishirnera yes kunchera ardasukov devatsi naineran yerekuinov neviragan mevneshan topovi teshnamutem top mishpanza hayastan topovi teshnamutem top mishpanza hayastan amen der mamie martian kamit merni paitierani voluraski azaduchan gozovi paitierani voluraski azaduchan gozovi.
Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tamar Gregorian, the ANCA Eastern Region's Communications Director, with a message from the ANC Eastern Region. The ANC Eastern Region works with a network of chapters and supporters throughout the eastern United States and actively advances the concerns of the Armenian American community on a broad range of issues.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening. Before I begin, I'd like to thank our speakers, congressional friends, coalition partners, sister organization, and you, our viewers, who have joined us this evening to commemorate the 105th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. My name is Tamar Gregorian, and I am the ANCA Eastern Region Communications Director. I am honored to be here this evening with you to welcome you to our virtual April 24 commemoration. More importantly, I am honored to be here today before you as a first-generation Armenian American and a grandchild of a survivor of the Armenian Genocide. Over the course of the past few months, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our lives in unprecedented ways. No matter what city, state, country, or part of the world you live in, we have all had to adjust to our new normal. Some of you are working on the front lines of the COVID-19 response as first responders, healthcare workers, and in other essential businesses. I know I speak for us all when I say thank you. Your selfless service is invaluable. Throughout it all, we have seen stories of hope and stories of loss. And I can't help but think about the parallels between those stories and the ones that came out of the Armenian genocide. As Armenian Americans, we've all had to cancel our community's commemorative events throughout the month of April. I know how much these events mean to us as we gather in our churches, in front of our memorials, at our peaceful protests and film screenings. Over the past 6 decades, we have seen our commemorations come full circle as we not only remember, but work to educate, motivate, and activate. We work to educate all children about the crime of genocide to prevent future atrocities, ending the cycle of genocide. We work to mobilize and engage our communities to take action as we advocate on the city, state, and federal level. Last year, we witnessed 2 historic milestones in the fight for justice and recognition as both the U.S. House and Senate voted to overwhelmingly pass Armenian genocide resolutions. Now we continue that call for justice, for truthful affirmation of the Armenian genocide from the executive branch and from Ankara, officially ending Turkey's gag rule on its inhumane crime against the Armenian nation, a crime that the government of Turkey has denied for generations. Denial, as Professor Gregory Stanton of the International Association of Genocide Scholars noted, is the final stage of genocide. Denial or any attempt to rewrite history is a continued affront to the Armenian nation, one that we have endured for 105 years. Thus, as we commemorate our past throughout the weekend, we will hear from our thought leaders and activists about our next steps. We will take up the call for justice for my grandmother, all of the survivors, and the more than 1.5 million martyrs. Because as a wise woman once told me, we didn't come this far to only come this far.
Thank you, Tamar. That was wonderful, powerful, inspiring. Next, we have the force of nature we call Aram Hamparian, one of the hardest working, most dedicated people I know, and also the smartest. Aram, of course, is the executive director of the ANCA, working in coordination with a network of offices, chapters, and supporters throughout the United States and affiliated organizations around the world. The ANCA actively advances the concerns of the Armenian American community on a spectacular array of critical issues. Its goals? To foster public awareness in support of a free, united, and independent Armenia. To influence and guide U.S. policy on matters of interest to us all. To represent the collective Armenian American view on matters of public policy while serving as liaison between the community and their elected officials. To empower Armenian Americans to advance key strategic objectives, including protecting the independent republics of Armenia and Artsakh, expanding the U.S.-Armenia and U.S.-Artsakh partnerships, securing justice for the Armenian genocide, advancing constructive foreign aid policies, threats to security of Armenia, the sovereignty of Artsakh, and the welfare of at-risk Armenian communities worldwide. Adam, the lectern is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's always an honor to appear with you. I'm a huge fan. My family, everyone I know are huge fans. And so many folks who never, ever mentioned to me anything about being Armenian approached me as an Armenian after they read the Sandcastle Girls, and it was kind of a landmark in the introduction of this issue in the country. So many Americans and folks worldwide. So the impact is massive. I mean, culture is so powerful. Art and culture drive politics. Politics is like a subset of culture, because the culture is driven by artists and artists like yourself. So very, very thank you for the very, very warm introduction, Tamar. It's a treat to see Dr. McCalpin. The last time we saw was up on Capitol Hill when he offered a lecture, which was really, really like a tour de force of the reparations movement and the place of the Armenians within that movement, and how we can support that, and how the world can put their to the wheel of justice for the Armenians, but how in turn Armenians can help others as well. This is all one common thread. Justice is not a thing apart. One nation's justice is not separate from the justice owed to all. We seek truth, right? But not truth for its own purposes. Truth in the service of justice, right? I believe that the Armenian nation is owed justice. And this is not an Armenian idea, of course. The idea that that crimes should be punished is a commonly accepted idea. The convention itself that outlaws genocide, that was passed by the United Nations in 1948, is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. So this idea that there should be justice is a commonly accepted idea, and it goes something like this. That which was taken should be returned. That which cannot be returned should be compensated. The victim should be made whole. There's very few justice systems in the world that do not adhere to those basic propositions. So we seek truth, but truth in the service of justice. Okay, what form might justice take? We would argue that it is reparations. It is, like I said, the return of things that were taken and the compensation for things that cannot be returned. Those are reparations. Why would we want reparations? Is it a matter of vengeance? Is it a matter of somehow settling scores? Is it a backward-looking proposition where we feel cheated by destiny and we want to be compensated in some fashion? No, that's not the case at all. The argument for truth, the argument for justice, the argument for reparations is to restore to Armenia the things that it needs to survive, the elements of viability denied to this nation that has been around for 5,000 plus years, that in different ways was able to survive on its ancient homeland through its agricultural resources, through its defensible borders, through its demographics. The various elements that allowed the Armenian nation to survive on its ancient homeland were in great measure stolen from it in 1915. And Armenia was left with a question mark over its viability. To this day, Armenia is a landlocked, blockaded, partitioned nation surrounded by enemies in a very, very difficult neighborhood. And this is, by and large, the consequence of genocide. So when we talk about truth, the truth is for justice, justice is for reparations, but reparations are for the types of security that Armenia needs to survive. This is a nation saying, in the wake of genocide, in the wake of its near death, in the wake of a wound that, God forbid, may one day prove fatal, right? A nation standing up to that and saying, well, we're not ready to die yet. We're not ready to toss in the towel. We believe that we owe our place. We deserve our place at the table of nations. We have a lot to contribute to the world. We feel the world has a lot to contribute to us. We want to survive. We want to live. And we will not accept the proposition that, well, what's done is done, and I guess we just have to learn to live. There are folks who might say that, well, that is an adventurous path. That is a reckless path. I would say just the opposite. The idea that in Armenia, in this situation, partitioned, blockaded, landlocked as it is, denied so many of its elements of viability, that in Armenia, in this situation, is the safe path. Well, let's just coast home on this glide path. That's not the safe path. In fact, that's the dangerous path. Justice is the path to the survival of the Armenian nation. We are owed it on a moral level, but we require it on a realistic level, in the plane of politics, in the plane of reality. Justice is a vital ingredient of the future of the future of the Armenian nation. Folks will argue sometimes that you folks are looking back. Absolutely not. We're actually the ones looking forward. We're looking forward. There are others, and there are others who will sometimes say, how could there conceivably be consequences today for a crime that happened 100 years ago? The people who ask that question are entirely blind to the consequences of that crime 100 years later. They have all fallen upon the shoulders of the victims, right? So the victims have dealt with the partition of their homeland, the destruction of the demographics, the lack of defensible borders, the lack of agricultural land, the lack of all those, many of those elements of viability that are required of a nation in the world today, right? The consequences, the costs have fallen upon our shoulders, and every benefit, every reward has accrued to the perpetrator in the form of land, in the form of wealth, in the form of security, in iteration, in example after example. The rewards of genocide continue to this day. The costs of genocide continue to this day. Those costs, by the way, are compounded over time. Turkey is a vastly more powerful nation by virtue of its crime, and Armenia, sadly, is much weaker today by virtue of its crime, which points, I think, to the cruelty of those who say, well, let the Armenians and the Turks work this out. It's like, well, no, this is not. In what system of government or justice does the government say, well, let the rapist and the raped work it out, or let the assaulted and the assaulter work it out? No, this is an issue of them. That's why we have institutions, governments. That's why we have international bodies. And if we were to say, for example, toss this back to the Armenians and the Turks and say, well, you guys work it out. It's just a conflict, perhaps even a misunderstanding that can be resolved just by some discussion, right? Not by a judicial system. Think about the inequities, the asymmetries. You already had this profoundly powerful Ottoman Empire that decided to wipe out an unarmed population, and they did so. And as a result, that unarmed population became vastly weaker. So the idea is something like, well, the Turks were vastly more powerful than the Armenians prior to the genocide. Post-genocide, it became even more asymmetrical, but you guys go work it out on some equitable terms. And who can imagine that the lion and the lamb in this situation could come to an understanding that does not serve the stronger of the two? So the idea of dumbing this issue down to a conflict, or even worse, a misunderstanding, to try to take it out of the realm of crime and criminal justice and move into the realm of conflict resolution, as if people just don't have the right words to talk to each other. These are important factors. These are why this issue is so profoundly important to the ANCA, but to Armenians around the world, to people who believe in justice around the world. This is not something that we. This is an element of Armenia's survival, and we're gonna fight as aggressively for this as we do for Artsakh or for Armenia's security. They are all aligned with our North Star, which is the future survival, the future viability, the future security of an Armenian nation. We think it is not our time to pass from the scene, and we will not let that happen. And part of staying upon remaining at the table of nations is fighting for justice for the Armenian genocide. Now, that takes me to that's a theory of it. The theory is we will survive, and this is an important part of our survival. The practice of it is always a bit less interesting, less aspirational, a little less but it's important, and that's where the work happens. And the Tamar mentioned, and this is very important, that last session of Congress, both houses of Congress, nearly unanimously, 98% of all members voted in support of genocide resolutions in the House and Senate. Those resolutions went beyond just marking April 24th. They establishes the policy of Congress that America recognizes this crime, America rejects the denial of this crime, and America wants its children to learn the lessons of this atrocity. So they're really, really strong resolutions. They lock in recognition, they lock out denial, and they do that on behalf of the U.S. Congress, which writes our laws, but doesn't have its hands on the wheel of U.S. foreign policy. That's the White House. Our Constitution gives the executive branch that authority. So our next step is to leverage this overwhelming bipartisan, near unanimous passage by the Congress, to leverage that into recognition by the president. Now, that may be by this president, maybe by the next president. It's unclear how things will play out. But what is clear, what is absolutely clear, is that this is where America is going. We are moving steadily in the right direction. It's taking longer than any of us wanted, but we are moving from a hardline position, a Cold War position of the U.S. Enabling, being implicit in the worst forms of genocide denial, the worst forms of obstruction of justice, nothing happened and the Americans kind of covered up for the Turkish lies at that extreme, to this recognition that something happened, to the recognition that, of course, it was the Turks, now to the recognition, forthright recognition by the U.S. Congress. And we're going to get the executive branch on next. And then we move from there, from them sort of breaking with non-recognition, breaking with complicity with denial, and moving into a proactive space where they're leaning on Turkey, where they make part of the U.S.-Turkey bilateral relationship, Turkey coming to grips, Turkey recognizing honestly with its past, with its responsibilities. This is where we're heading, and I feel confident that we will get there. Again, this April, next April, the April after that. Armenians are nothing if not persistent, and we can be patient, maybe to a fault sometimes, but we are going to be super aggressive about this. We're going to get the White House on the right side of the issue, and then move America to the right side of the whole equation, eventually with the goal, right? The goal being that Turkey, absent U.S. backing, absent, they've already lost European backing, they've lost the backing of like a dozen NATO allies, but absent U.S. support, maybe the British, maybe the Australians, a few others step in, maybe Israel, who knows? And then Turkey finds itself isolated and alone, and realizes that it's not sustainable. We're not in a position, this is not tenable for us to carry this denial forward, and we're willing, the costs of denial, of being a pariah, of being an outcast, an outlier on this issue are sufficiently high that we will sit down with the Armenians. Now, of course, what does that mean? What form does it take? What might come from that process? That's the next stage of the process. That's where this is heading. But I'm confident that we've made steady progress, especially since last fall, and that we'll continue to make steady progress. And Tamar, with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Aram. Inspiring and brilliant. Listening to Tamar and then Aram, you know that our future, our political future, is in the right hands. I am so grateful to the two of you. Now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Jermaine McCalpin. I had the privilege of serving on a panel with Jermaine in 2016 in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I was gobsmacked listening to his wisdom, his brilliance, and his insight. Jermaine, the chair of the African and African American Studies at New Jersey City University, is internationally recognized as an expert and consultant on transitional justice, genocides, and reparations. He has traveled to South Africa, Cambodia, Armenia, and across the United States and Canada, researching and presenting on the Armenian genocide, the transatlantic trade in Africans and reparations, truth commissions, and issues of justice. His research interests include truth commissions, commissions of inquiry and political accountability, reparations for historic injustice, such as slavery, the Native American, and the Armenian genocides. Jermaine, the virtual lectern is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good evening. As we commemorate this very important, I don't call it a celebration, I call it a remembrance, because so much of it is solemn, so much of it is what has happened in the past and what we anticipate will happen. I want to first of all thank ANCA. I feel so privileged to have been asked to do this evening on April 24th. I feel humbled, primarily because I've done so many of these lectures, but there's never a time at which I tire of talking about these issues. Why? Because they're critical to the cause of justice. I've been presenting on the Armenian genocide for 13 years now, and I've traveled the length and breadth of the United States to talk about these issues. And the privilege that ANC has extended to me, I do not count a small privilege. To the Eastern Region, to Aram, to Tamar, to George, to all the other persons that with who I served on that panel April 21st, I think, 2016. I want to tell you thanks, and to tell all the persons that have supported what I do in the Armenian community, from the West Region, Nora, Henry Therio, Kachig, all of the persons. There are too many names to call, but I want to acknowledge the importance of a community. There's a Kenyan proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to nurture a legacy of justice. And I think this Armenian village is very critical to our moving forward on this question of justice. I don't want to talk too much, but I want to lay what I've been thinking about as an idea for how we understand justice. Aram has so skillfully designated the parameters of the discussions about justice, and I want to expand those parameters a little more. The recognition that we have advocated for is but one dimension of justice. And so when we talk about justice, recognition, and this is an internal recognition, we are still advocating for wide-scale international recognition and also domestic recognition, i.e. Turkey. So recognition is only one dimension of justice. I want to make the argument that when we talk about justice, I want to think of 6 R's. The first is obviously recognition. Recognition is not only just an acknowledgement, but it is also an attempt to indicate that we recognize that something so gravely unjust has occurred. And this is why recognition in and of itself can't be justice, because the recognition points to the need for rectification. And that's the second dimension of justice. We can't talk about only recognition, we have to talk about rectification. What are we rectifying? When I think of the Armenian genocide, I think of the reality that historic injustice requires rectification. When we talk about rectification as political scientists and historians, we're talking about setting the records right. Part of the problem with denial is that it creates a notion of history that rewrites truth out of existence. And so recognition is an attempt to rewrite truth back into existence. So when we talk about recognition, it leads to rectification. This second dimension of justice is equally important. I want to use the metaphor, a pugilistic metaphor of a boxing match. We punched very hard in the first round, but that is just the first round. It's a heavyweight fight and it has 10 rounds. And so we have gotten this kind of recognition, but we still have 9 more rounds to go. It's a boxing match, and we have to ensure that we strategize so we still have punches left when we get to the last round. And that last round we will get to is when Turkey has no other option but to admit to its crimes and to seek to rectify the past. So the first is recognition. The second is rectification. The third we can think of as restoration. Now, I do a lot of work on restorative justice, and when we talk about restoration, we're talking about making something or someone whole that was broken or that was previously harmonious. Now, the reality of it is that Armenia, as the longest standing, longest established Christian nation in the world, points to this kind of reality that for 5,000 years, Armenia has had this glorious and noble history. The contact and the interaction and the co-domicility with the Turks is not the issue. The problem here becomes this idea that when we talk about history, we often eclipse the reality that the Armenians need restoration. I often say that it is an inherited trauma. So Armenians have passed this kind of trauma through generations. It's an intergenerational trauma. It is the same kind of effect that happens when we talk about slavery and the transatlantic trade in Africans, that this bequeathing, this bequest has been trauma across generations. There is enough evidence to point to the psychological effects of trauma across generations. And so Armenians have settled into this kind of ignobility, not of their own volition, into this second classness because what? They continue to be seen as victims rather than triumphant survivors of the genocide. So restoration is psychological, but I argue that restoration also has to be physical, material. Material restoration of buildings, of churches, of monasteries, of properties, of things that have been sequestered and can be returned. So when we talk about restoration, when we talk about restoration, this idea of restoring, I want people to understand that at the heart of restoration is the dignity of the Armenian people that was taken from them. Those marches through the Syriac desert, those forced marches, those forced hunger and famine and marched into exile, that requires a restoration of dignity. They were undignified. They were treated as undignified people. And so that trauma has been legacized across generations. And so when we talk about restoration, we have to talk about first the human. And that is why the other dimension of justice I want to talk about, if you are counting, is now rehumanization. So we do recognition, right? We do recognition. But recognition also has to have rectification, restoration, and now rehumanization. We know that genocide, part of the argument is that one of the stages is dehumanization. Now, I don't want you to think of the stages as somehow, okay, this happened only when the genocide was committed. For the last 105 years, we are essentially arguing that the reason for remembering and for wanting justice is to rehumanize Armenians. Armenians across the world must be rehumanized as a glorious and noble people. We didn't say perfect. Perfection is not the criterion for justice. It is that the crime, it is that an act of injustice was committed. And so we are talking about rehumanization, that the Armenian personality needs to be rehumanized, redignified. We can't reinter those who have been lost at sea, lost in the desert, but we can rehumanize them by giving to their progeny reparations. And so when we talk about justice, justice has 6 dimensions. And I will conclude them by saying that all of those dimensions lead to the ultimate R, and that is reparations. So if you're following the trajectory, all of those R's will lead to reparations, and reparations, as I define it, is justice. Right? So when we talk about reparations, we're not just talking about money, we're talking about all these different dimensions of repair. And so the other one is redemption. Both Turkey and the Turkish state is in need of redemption. We often seek to only focus on the survivor group. And I want to make it clear that this indemnification is not against individual Turks. It is against the Turkish state who endorsed, who supported, who eroded, who rewrote, and who has essentially written the Armenian genocide out of existence. So when we talk about this question, we have to be clear that we're talking about redeeming the Armenian personality. What is redemption? Redemption ultimately places the emphasis on the perpetrator group, on the perpetrator state, to essentially not just acknowledge that something wrong happened, but that 105 years of lack of rectification still means that justice is required. We have this argument that we often declare that justice delayed should not be justice denied. And so 105 years, if we can multiply, millions of Armenians would have passed without seeing the virtue of their cause and the righteousness of their cause rectified. And so we here in the present, and I speak we because the Armenian genocide and recognition of the Armenian genocide is not just the repository of the Armenian people. It has to be that we have to clamor for justice for all aggrieved, historically marginalized groups. And so my advocacy for justice for the Armenian cause is because of its central importance to understanding of injustice across all different jurisdictions. And so in closing, I want us to continue with the pugilistic metaphor of boxing. We have to regain strength. We had a strong round in this first round of recognition, but we have to keep fighting. ANCA's efforts, we now have to redouble because the fight will get even more intense as the fight goes along. As it progresses, we will require more allies and more armory. I want you to think of the reality that when we talk about reparations, the key to reparation is making something that was once whole restored to wholeness. The reality of reparation is that it stands as justice because justice isn't just doing the fair thing, justice is doing the right thing. And I want to be clear that we're not just advocating for a fair thing to do, we are articulating this truth that justice is the right thing to do. If you are a friend of truth, then you must be a friend of justice because truth and justice are melded together. There is a synergy that is inseparable. And so as I bring my remarks to a close, I want you to understand that when we talk about justice, we have to be prepared to fight. It will not be handed to us. It may not even be negotiated. We have to take power in our hands and ensure that those who continue to deny the Armenian genocide, those who continue to deny the importance of the Armenian genocide vis-a-vis justice, they must be taught the lesson of history. The only way that history can absolve us is if we do the right thing. And the right thing to do is justice. You see, denial has created an alternate notion of truth that indicates that these people essentially cause these kinds of things on themselves. And I often make the argument that genocides are extreme national building projects. Nations have been formed out of the proceeds of genocide. And so the Armenian no longer figures prominently within this cadre and this aegis of what became Turkey. And we are advocating for a return to history. We have departed from history, not because those who advocate for justice somehow feel that it is weak. It is because those of the perpetrator group and their allies have essentially negated the truth that we continue to cry out. We may be the voice crying in the wilderness, but we will continue to cry out. Justice delayed must not be justice denied. I want us to be clear that we have to continue in the spirited fight that ANCA is leading here in the United States, and we have to make it a nationwide fight, but also a global fight. And I'm very encouraged because when I started this work, we were nowhere near to recognition here in the United States. But because of the advocacy of the ANCA, we can count that as a victory. If you are into boxing, we have scored the better in the first round, but we still have 9 rounds to go. We have 9 rounds to go, and we must ensure that we are fit for the fight. And so in that, and with that, I want to bring my remarks to a close, and I want to say a blessing to all the martyrs who have suffered for the cause of justice and for those who continue to be strident advocates for justice. Thank you.
Jermaine, that was extraordinary. And I really liked the boxing analogy. When I think of that, when I think of Tamar, Aram, and you in our corner, I have faith in the next 9 rounds. Now, we are not done. There is much to come this weekend. Tomorrow, Saturday, the Armenian Youth Federation will be delivering their message, discussing the new generation's efforts in pursuing justice for the Armenian genocide, striving for the recognition of Artsakh, and championing a long litany of Armenian causes. These young people are doing the work of the angels, and they are relentless and smart and driven in all the best ways. On Sunday, please join us to watch the ANCA Eastern Region debut, a series of videos including a montage of April 24th events from throughout the region's 30 three states, beginning in the 1960s and culminating with the 219 commemoration, the 104th last year. We will also see footage from Western Armenia provided by my friends and travel companions, Georgia Jan and Dr. Hachig Maradian. And finally, a call to action from the network of activists throughout the region. And on Monday, we will resume our work from wherever we are sheltering in place, because the work continues. Reparations and restoration, rehumanization, all of the R's. As I said earlier this evening, we are living in history. I have thought a lot during the pandemic of something Zabel Yessian once wrote. We are very aware that we are in the middle of a war, but we are still continuing our calm and monotonous lives. We walk, all of us, in this strange spring of 2020. We put one foot in front of the other and we move forward. Yes, we as Armenians are destined to look back over our shoulders, but not as victims, as triumphant survivors, as the descendants of a very, very strong people. And yet we still walk looking forward, seeing the future, and against all odds are making progress here and abroad, in the US Capitol and in our beloved homeland, in Artsakh. The future is bright, my friends. Yes, we will all know where we were, when, and we will look back on this April 24th, 2020, and we will know this too. The water goes, the sand remains, the person dies, the memory remains. I love that Armenian proverb. I would now like to welcome His Eminence, Archbishop Anoushavan Tanielian, for his message and his closing prayer.
Օգնություն եւ փառք, ող եւ ողջո եւ ողջույնը քո, այժմ եւ միշտ եւ հավիտյանս հավիտենից ամեն։ Beloved children of God, this is a year that finds us all apart from each other by reason of an unprecedented pandemic. And yet, that distance is only physical, as we all experience in our daily communications with family and friends. People are rediscovering a profound sense of solidarity and kinship. We are finding that we have much more in common than what sets us apart. The 20th century, the bloodiest in our history, was the century of the genocide and the unbearable loss that inevitably hurts us. But it was also the century of the rebirth of Armenia as an independent nation and the liberation of Artsakh. There are 3 anniversaries that bring us together as a nation this year. We mark the 200th anniversary of the birth of Mugardich Crimean, Catholicos of all Armenians, and beloved by our nation as our father. To every Armenian, he is Hrimian Hayrik. As much a Christian as an Armenian, Hrimian Hayrik was keenly aware that our faith also calls us to stand against injustice. He was a witness to the unfair treatment Armenians received at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, shortchanged of every right previously granted by the Treaty of San Stefano. Hence, his sermon to bring an iron ladle to the table of the victors. These days, we also observe 2 anniversaries that stand in our horizon as a reassurance and as a challenge. It is the centennial of the Treaty of Sèvres, which was followed by the arbitral award of President Woodrow Wilson, which defined the borders between Armenia and Turkey. Our homeland is free and independent, but it is still split. The half of Armenia, 9/10 of our homeland, actually on the other side of the Arax River, including Mount Ararat, is still ruled by the very state that perpetrated the genocide. Hrimian Hayrik knew all too well. We still need to bring the iron ladle to the table. And then, on April 24, we mark the 105th anniversary of the genocide. It finds us strong, united across the continents and oceans, and with our memories alive. Our martyrs are today our saints, yet, as a nation, with our joint and unbreakable willpower, we will also make sure that they and us as their descendants also receive earthly justice, which will be served as a role model preventing future genocides and will generate prosperity in the region and in the world at large. Զիքոյակ հայություն և զորություն և փառք Հավիտյանս Հավիտենից ամեն